Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Out of Spec podcast. I'm your host, Francie. Thank you for plugging in with us today for another electric topic. And that is, well, as the automotive industry is undergoing this pretty monumental shift towards electrification, understanding how reliability is measured and how consumer feedback is gathered and how we're reporting all of this and adapting it to fit the changing environment is pretty crucial. So in today's episode, we're going to delve into the insights from consumer reports with Alex Knizek, exploring the dynamic landscape of how we evaluate electric vehicles and electrified vehicles like hybrids. And with these evolving methodologies comes other implications, of course, for consumers and how we not only gather but report this information, like I said. So with this conversation, we're going to talk about what Consumer Reports does, how their methods have changed over time, and discuss how reliability and our understanding of that has undergone change with the electrification of our transportation system. So let's get into it. This episode is made possible by the support we get from Fort Collins Kia. If you are in the market for any electric Kia, not only do they never add market adjustments, they will deliver your car to you anywhere in the 48 contiguous states for out-of-spec viewers. More information in the link in the show notes. So thank you for joining me, Alex. Can you tell me a bit more about your role at Consumer Reports as Associate Director of Auto Test Development?
Sure. Yeah, no, first of all, thank you for having me. It's always great to get to talk to people in the industry about our work, and certainly electric vehicles. I'm a big fan of EVs and hybrids and all these electrified types of powertrains. It's quite a lot of fun to see it all changing. But so my role here is really to make sure that our testing is, following said changes, really, as electric vehicles become popular and, a viable option for consumers. It's making sure that our testing reflects that. And so not only is it reflects this changing technology, but also what consumers care about. So in the world of EVs, of course, we're thinking about range and charging and these things that are kind of unique to EVs. But, also part of my job is to make sure that the testing that we are currently doing or have been doing for a long time also stays up to date and also still, reflects what consumers care about. So, thinking about controls and usability, for example, just to pick something, used to look one way with buttons and knobs and all these things, right? And of course, as technology moves on and we have more screens and touch screens and infotainment becomes more of a focus, right? If you want to throw the software-defined vehicle term out there, the test, as it were, kind of looks different as time goes on, right? We just need to make sure we're capturing the things that are relevant at this point in time. So that's, I guess, the elevator pitch of what I'm supposed to be doing.
Love that. Yeah, nice. And I think that's pretty clear. And that makes me think of how many menus do I have to go to get to this crucial setting that is for some reason buried in the software of this EV, which
exactly.
I'm sure you've seen.
Yeah, we see that all the time. EVs like to get, all the latest and greatest technology for better or worse, which, will lead into our conversation today for sure. But so that can often mean menus upon menus upon menus to get to seemingly basic stuff.
Exactly. I love a good mix of buttons in there personally.
Yeah, like mix, you know what? A mix is good.
A mix is good. Got to find balance. I think that is so key in almost everything we talk about here on the Out of Spec podcast. Balance, taking the lessons learned and applying them. So let's start maybe with big picture items, because I've studied and worked in research for many years of my life before now. And, sometimes this is research too, but being a part of a good researcher is knowing where your research has pitfalls, weak spots, falls flat, whatever it is. And sometimes it's just unavoidable, right? I mean, I did biological research, which is a little bit different, but it's important to be forthright about those assumptions and the limitations to the research. And for instance, with surveys, they attract a certain kind of person who wants to sit down and take a survey and give their feedback, and they're optional, right? So there tends to be a little bit of a skewness in the data because it includes a certain kind of person. So that's just a fact. And I think, when you're dealing with surveys, that's just what you're dealing with. And with consumer reports, one of the maybe, notes that I've seen a lot about your reporting is that there is a reliance on this self-reported data, which some argue may introduce a bias or, certain kind of, I don't know, maybe not inaccuracies, but influences into the evaluation of this, of your system. So How do y'all address these critiques about the, representativeness and accuracy of your member surveys, especially concerning electric vehicles? And what steps are you taking? And is it just members still, or what's behind that?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a great question, and absolutely it's something that we're very aware of, and yeah, just always trying to, I guess, do better over time. Um to answer your last part of that question, yes, it is still our membership, is the who this survey goes out to, and ultimately who completes the survey. So um yeah, I would say over time, as we try to our best to expand the membership, especially getting into a more diverse audience and these things, the hope being that that membership grows, right, and reflects more and more people. So trying to get the membership grown in that way. Um, but yes, you're right. I mean, it does take a certain type of person to sit down and fill out the survey, and it is ultimately optional. So that's definitely true. Um, I would say over time, we really are trying to focus on quality over quantity, I would say, with a lot of the data, right? I think if you go back in our history, it would be, really touting like the maximum number of data points, right? But maybe those questions that were being asked weren't as thorough as they are now. So I think as we go forward, it's really trying to, if somebody is going to take the time to answer that question, getting the most out of it, I guess, if that makes sense, as opposed to just making sure that we have the maximum number possible of responses. But yeah, and then changing the last part, I guess I would answer that with changing the way that we on the back end, I suppose, formulate if we're talking about reliability, right? That predicted reliability, rather than just looking at one specific type of information. Say, if we're talking about the Ford Mustang Mach-E, for example, just picking a random vehicle, only looking at data for the Ford Mustang Mach-E. Well, okay, maybe we can look at a larger set of data and come up with an algorithm to better predict reliability that includes more than just that specific vehicle, right? We can look at Ford's, overall history, for example, or things like that. So incorporating more, getting more out of the data, I suppose, rather than just breadth, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the big picture as well. That's an interesting idea, to kind of consider the historic data of the automaker itself as they step into this, new undertaking, for sure. It makes me wonder, with your members, what percent, or maybe portion right now, own electric vehicles? Do you I mean, maybe not an exact number, but like an idea?
Yeah. I don't have that number off the top of my head, but it's definitely less. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And so you'll see, there are times where we aren't able to, predict the reliability on something because we just don't have enough data for it, right? Especially as, brand new platforms and brand new models come out. But this kind of goes back to the idea of using, data from other parts of that manufacturer's history or things we know about it to come up with that prediction, rather than just waiting until that time where we have all the data for, I don't know, whichever model it might be. But yeah, so our members, it definitely is less than, we see a large increase in interest in hybrids. Still, of course, people wanting their gas only, vehicles, but honestly, less than EVs is plug-in hybrids. That's our new area where we probably have even less people owning those types of vehicles than EVs. So we see it going up, but as we know, our members generally follow the trend of the industry at large. So there's increase in the amount of people owning them, but it seems to be, I guess, flattening off a little bit these recent days, but it is still growing over time.
Interesting. Okay, and so with EVs being relatively new technology and thereby a new experience for consumers, do you think that in general, that, I mean, I would think if they're your member, they're probably have a good understanding of how to measure reliability, but it is a new kind of vehicle. So do you think that in general, they have a good understanding of how to measure reliability in an electric vehicle in comparison to the internal combustion engine options that we've known forever?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not so much, I guess, relying on our member to know how to measure it necessarily, but it really comes back to us to make sure we're asking the right questions, right? So it's making sure And maybe a good example of that is with charging, right? It would be really easy to ask a question about charging in the way of like, oh, it didn't charge as fast as I wanted, or I guess the question would be, did it charge as fast as he wanted? But somebody might not know whether that's because there was an issue with the charger or with the car, right? So it comes back, I think, to the framing of the question and doing our best possible to make sure that if somebody is going to say that there's a charging problem or there's a charging or a battery problem or something like that, that it's actually because of the car and not because the level 2 charger they decided to purchase wherever, was having some sort of issue, or just some interoperability issue with a DC charger, right, caused them to have a bad experience that then they go and fill out on our survey says that there's an actual issue with the car. So it's tricky. There's no doubt about it. It's tricky. But we do, when we do get all these responses back, not only is it check boxes and whatnot on a survey, but there's also a lot of verbatims that go along with it, written texts and comments. So it's labor intensive, but we go through each and every comment to make sure that it makes sense, right? If the person is saying X, we check against their words to make sure that it actually seems to be that they're experiencing that issue. So, but yeah, I mean, we're asking ultimately new questions to people that they haven't seen before.
Definitely. And I want to get into more of the the metrics that you are asking about and measuring, but also EV charging, you bring it up, and I think that's really interesting that we talk about this because you brought up a good point. Like, I, as a driver, and maybe I don't know much about charging, I don't know, maybe a problem came up, but I don't know the source of the issue.
Right.
And so how do we make sure to differentiate? I'm charging at a DC fast charger and I don't get the right charge because the charger's derated, or
right.
something else is the problem. How are you working to, and how can the industry as well, maybe we can, think about it, Consumer Reports, but big picture.
Yeah.
This is really affecting how people think of electric vehicles charging, and whether it's at home in your garage, hopefully that's working just as it needs to. You plug it overnight, you have enough charge in the day.
Right.
But how do we make sure to keep the public charging experience distinct from my EV is actually a good EV? It's just that I went to a crappy charger.
Yeah, right. Oh, I mean, that's the $1 million question right now in some ways. I mean, I think, industry wide and thinking about the infrastructure, if we could make the infrastructure more reliable, you would have less of these problems, right? You would have less people thinking that there's an issue because X and Y happened. But, if we can start with having reliable infrastructure and chargers, there would be less problems, hopefully, overall. I think you could start there, right? But otherwise, I think, there's a lot of, opportunity for education, I would say. And I think, that's a space that, we play in, and hopefully, I'd like to think do a pretty decent job of trying to explain to people like the different types of chargers and the speeds they might experience, what impacts the speed, right? We're used to filling up a gas car and it just happens, and it's basically the same way every time. You don't have to worry about how fast it's going to go into one tank versus the other, but you kind of have to think about these things in a new way now. So I think that's just part of these growing pains, right? And eventually, the more people get exposed to it, and you tell your one friend, they tell their next friend, that type of stuff, and you start to learn how these things work. I think eventually these types of problems and people will understand, and that will hopefully subside. But in the meantime, I think there's just a lot of area for education to happen.
I agree. There's a ton of information that we can share, and education potential. It's finding the right avenues, because some people just want to buy a car and be able to drive it and don't really want to have to learn anything about it. But it is so different from, or it can be very different from driving an internal combustion engine.
Right. And it's the whole DC charging thing is interesting because for most, not everybody, but for most people, that's the exception, not the rule, right? We know people are charging at their house most often, at least EV owners today. And yeah, I would agree with you that I'm assuming that most of the time that goes as planned, unless some fringe thing happens. But it's that one bad experience at a DC charger that can kind of stick with people, right? And I mean, I know for myself, just telling a story, like when I first started driving EVs, I think I was in an early Polestar 2 and didn't quite know how the DC charging experience was going to go, or I didn't know, I had never used EVgo. That was the network that was closest to me at the time where I was in an unfamiliar spot. And, it was difficult and kind of a disaster, if I'm honest. And like, it's really stuck with me. So, I've luckily been able to work through that with my job, right? And experience many other things. But if I was just a regular person without that, or without this career, like, that would be my lasting experience of DC charging a fast car. And it would just be like, nope, never doing that again. So a lot of opportunity, I suppose.
Definitely. And I think it's significant that that is linked to the experience of owning an electric vehicle, because that's your reality, is that sometimes you have to use public charging. And if you're not driving a Tesla, although there's been a lot of news about the Tesla supercharger network and what that will look like, hopefully it maintains all sorts of reliability that it's known for. But yes, with DC fast charging, if it's not going well for you, then that will be linked to your experience as a driver with an electric vehicle.
Right.
So, but I do think it is important that we keep those separated, although I understand the significance of them being linked. So, in your kind of surveys, do you have ways, or in your work, do you have ways that you're making sure to distinguish that from the reliability of the electric vehicle? It seems pretty clear to me, like this metric and this metric, but maybe now we can get into the metrics through which, or the metrics that you look for and the questions that you ask in your reporting.
Yeah, I mean, we're, obviously with electric vehicles, we're asking, most of the same things we've been asking in the past, as far as, I don't know, like in infotainment issues and paint and quality and fit and finish, all these things, right, that are kind of the same regardless of powertrain. But yeah, now with electric vehicles, we're asking questions again related to charging, batteries, motors, cooling systems you had before too, but more nuanced questions, I suppose.
Yes.
And asking about regen braking, all these things. So there's new areas that we're asking about for sure. And I think to try to separate those things, again, it comes back to the way we're asking the questions. So trying to give examples, right? Explain to people, like, when you're asking about a charging problem, say, I can't say the words exactly, but basically just trying to phrase it in a way that it's clear to them that we're asking about the vehicle, not the charger. And then honestly, erring on the side of caution when we get that feedback back, or the survey results back, it's combing through it all. And if we're unsure, it's, rather than using it, just don't use it. If we're not confident that the answer is about the vehicle and not about the hardware of the charger, then we just can't reliably use it, right? So I think at this point it would be nice to just put it through a filter or some sort of program to spit out the results, but at this point it's too nuanced to do that for us right now. So we really have to just go through it kind of line by line almost.
That makes sense. And with all there's technically like less moving parts in an EV, but it is they're different, some new and different parts. So to be able to accurately ask those questions so that you make sure that the survey taker is answering them is important. It seems significant. And certainly when you started introducing those surveys, when EVs started to be on the road, that has evolved over time. But also there's not much, historic long-term reliability data for electric vehicles. So how do you work with that? How does the absence of the historical data factored into your work and your reporting?
Yeah, I mean, I would say we have the most data essentially on Tesla, right? They've been on the road basically the longest. I mean, maybe not the model or the Leaf, but as a brand, right? Building electric vehicles. And also there's a lot of them. So we have a lot of data on Tesla. So we can kind of see, at least from that brand's perspective, how things have changed over time, among other brands too. And I think, we see the trend is really not that different compared to other types of powertrains and vehicles, in that, new platforms and new technologies are, just generally speaking anyway, less reliable at the start, and then they kind of mature over time and get more reliable. I mean, you see it with new gas car platforms too. and then you have brands, new brands entering the EV space, right? I mean, this is like it kind of reminds me, not that I was alive for it, I guess, but in just reading about like the early 1900s when there was so many different car companies, right? Just everybody trying to build cars. It maybe not quite that level, but it feels a little bit like that, right? Between Rivian and Lucid and Fisker and all these. So, I mean, those brands can be tough, right? That's a moment where, especially like, thinking about Rivian, you just ultimately don't have the historical data. It's just not there. So even though we like to use as much as possible, at least 3 years worth of data, that might not be possible, especially, thinking about Fisker too. So, that's when we have to make a decision with whether we just say, hey, we don't have sufficient data for this vehicle, or if there's something else we can rely on from the brand. But it makes it a little bit more difficult in those situations to give something that's accurate and useful, frankly, for consumers. So sometimes it's just we have to wait and see. But hey, the general trend that we've seen over 100 years of doing this, give or take, right, is that new technologies can be less reliable. So we can at least rely on that type of historical knowledge.
And then, recently there was a little bit of, I don't know, maybe not a paradox. I'm not sure if I'm using that exactly right, but Rivian in your reporting was rated as one of the least reliable EVs cars, but one of the consumer favorites. So can you speak a little bit to that, the dichotomy between those? You think, oh, it's not the most reliable. Why does everyone love it?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it is seemingly confusing. Oh, it is confusing. I think we're still in I know it gets said all the time, but like the early adopter phase of EVs, right? Where, especially somebody that's willing to, I guess, spend that type of money on a car company that is new, that doesn't have like a storied history of building vehicles that you can rely on, right? And look to for indication of how it might perform or hold up over time. So, just like we were talking about the person who's willing to fill out a survey, I think this is a specific type of person too, right? So they might be willing to put up with certain things that somebody looking for a Toyota Prius might not be, right? So even though the reliability is not as great, they're not as turned off by it in a sense, right? Because the vehicle's great otherwise, right? Just because it has reliability issues in a sense, it doesn't mean it doesn't perform incredibly well and handle and ride amazing and all this off-road capability. Like the vehicle is amazing, don't get me wrong. It's just, again, the new technologies and these EVs are packed full of pretty much everything. I mean, the Rivian in particular, with its hydraulic roll control and air suspension and adaptive shocks and all the stuff, right? It's got everything. So there's a lot to go wrong. But so it is interesting. And I think, also you see a lot of times with, owner satisfaction and things like this, with especially thinking about somebody with a Rivian or a car like that at that type of caliber, it's probably not their only car. I'm making an assumption there. I don't know Rivian owners specifically always have a different car or whatever, but a big part of satisfaction, if you think about it, is like how inconvenienced am I by the fact that this vehicle is unreliable or something like that, because it's got to spend all this time in the shop or whatever. And if it's your only car, you're probably going to be a lot more upset if it's spending all this time in the shop than if you can just kind of drive something else. So that's more of I guess, a theory of my own, but
Yeah, I think that's an interesting. I'm thinking about the folks who I know who own Rivians, and it isn't their only car.
Right.
So I'm sure there are these external factors that will always factor into reporting or to these, kind of like, I'm a survey taker. I'm living my life, and it's colored by my experience, of course. And you might be an EV enthusiast as well if you have an EV.
Right.
So, you, like you said, are more accepting of the reliability, perhaps issues that you run into. So you were talking about, the different technologies that are built into these EVs. Can you add a bit more color to that and tell me a bit more about what you've seen as the EVs have added all these wonderful bells and whistles and embraced the new technology? But has there been maybe like I don't know. Can you speak to maybe what those are and how you've been factoring those into your surveys as well?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess just thinking about electric vehicles in general, most of them tend to, they tend to have, all the latest and greatest as far as infotainment systems being, everything integrated into the touchscreen and electronic vents, things like that for the air conditioning and things like that. The door handles, right? A lot of electric popping out door handles, things like that. And because these tend to be higher spec vehicles, you end up getting into things like adaptive suspension and four-wheel steering. We're seeing making a huge comeback, especially on EVs with stretched wheelbases, and starting prices of $75,000. You can get away with putting stuff like that in a lot more. So, and then they, on regardless of, I guess, what the vehicle's equipped with, most of the electric vehicles that we have right now are first generation products on new platforms, right? I mean, thinking about like Mercedes EQ electric vehicles. I mean, it's a little bit of a modified platform from something they had already, but for all intents and purposes, it's new. Of course, Tesla, they're kind of their own story, but Rivian's platform is all new. Nissan with the Aria, there's a lot of new technology in there. Ultium from GM. So the list goes on, right? So these are new products, basically. And so, I think with a lot of the newer entrants into the market, you do see issues with the actual EV hardware in a sense, right? I mean, battery issues or onboard chargers failing, things like that, things that actually need to be replaced, right? Whereas EVs that have been around longer, thinking about Tesla, you actually don't see that motors and batteries are their biggest problems. I mean, this is probably not a surprise to certainly you or probably many people, but like it's other issues, right? In terms of build quality, trim and paint and things like that, that kind of drag its overall reliability down. So, but yeah, you definitely see some of the newer electric vehicles do struggle with motors and batteries and things like that are specific to the powertrain.
Interesting. Yeah. And I would think that, of course, build quality, Tesla is mass producing these, but if I don't have a problem with my battery or with charging or my range or the software, sure. I would, is it weighted in with your reporting in that way where it's like, this is minor versus major?
For sure. Yeah. And I meant to bring that up to address the rest of your question. But yes, it is. A battery issue that leaves you stranded is by no means held to the same weight as, the A-pillar trim falling off or something like that. So it is considered. And yeah, you could certainly argue, and I hear this all the time, like should reliability only be those things that could potentially leave you stranded on the side of the road? Yeah, I mean, I totally understand that. And that's something that we're constantly thinking about. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that, but
I do think that's,
right now it does include things that are not necessarily going to leave you stranded.
And I think that's where a lot of the conversation, even if it's misinformation or, fear of the newness comes from. It's like, how is this car going to be able to take me from point A to point B to point C back to point A? Just like I know that my ICE has been able to do for, my existence. So I do think, maybe it's the stranded factor or whatever it is, but there are the new technology where I think it's important to make sure that we have really accurate information of the picture of what your experience is going to be like that maybe you might not get unless you're in an EV. But a lot of the people don't necessarily have a friend with an EV or the opportunity to sit and drive in one. Or if you rent one, you might not get all the information you need and then you have a bad experience. Yeah. So I do think there's a lot of opportunity for error in a way where you're not getting a true experience, but also if that's your experience, that's your experience.
Yeah,
so, right. I think there's, again, a balance that we should search for, but I do think it's important. Yeah. The trim issues or something that, like you said, will not leave me stranded or does not have a significant problem with the electric specific technology. I do think that needs to be weighed separately. So I'd definitely be interested to hear, like what kind of, you don't have to tell me, of course, but I'm sure y'all are having conversations about that and how to adapt your inner workings to that.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's tricky, and I agree. It would actually be nice to like cut the data and just see. Okay, let's just look at powertrain issues from an ICE car and a hybrid and a EV and a plug-in hybrid. Like, just isolate that, right? Take everything else out of it, and it's something we could certainly investigate doing. Um, but it's also tough because we want it to be comparable, right? If we're always ultimately trying to serve the consumer, and the consumer audience that we have isn't necessarily the EV enthusiast or the the ICE enthusiast, for that matter. I mean, yeah, we have some for sure, but we want to be able to help the person that's just trying to decide if an electric vehicle is right for them, and or a hybrid or whatever, right? It's not necessarily the enthusiast. So allowing somebody to go onto our site and look at our information and look at, okay, here's what I can probably gauge my hybrid experience would be, or my ICE experience, or my electric car experience, right? And look at all that side by side. So that's a big component of it too, is just making sure that we can make those comparisons holistically. But I think, yeah, you could still do that by only looking at certain aspects too. So maybe getting a little bit more, I don't know, dynamic, if you will, with some of the data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does sound challenging if you're trying to give a full picture in a world where they're just very different vehicle experiences, going from filling up at a gas station to charging at your house to
right.
going to a supercharger instead of a gas station on a road trip.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, look, all this stuff is so new, or at least in its current form, and how quickly things are accelerating, that, yeah, I mean, we're always evolving and trying to make things better and more usable and helpful over time. So, yeah, we're always not trying to necessarily be stuck in old ways or anything like that, but yeah, just trying to be as helpful as we can.
Yeah, like, okay, we've been doing this. This is our, not necessarily tradition, but the way that we've been doing things.
Mhm.
How do we bring this to 2024?
Right,
I'm
right.
sure it's a challenge within, and yeah, I hope that y'all are addressing that, because you're pretty. I mean, you're a well-known source for this, and people
Yeah.
go to Consumer Reports, right? You come up on Google searches, so make sure you're having the accurate information. Yeah.
Right.
So, have you seen or let's talk about the concept of reality. Have you seen trends in how? Sorry, reality, reliability.
I was wondering where you were going.
The reality of that. Let's just get meta here and talk about reality.
It's like, I don't know what I got for you there, but I'll try.
How has the concept of reliability changed over time? Do you think it really just has to do with the electrification not being stranded, or like where are people's values going with reliability in 2024? Going into the future?
Yeah, I mean, for electric vehicles, I suppose, I think, it became, if you go like way back, right, more of the issues were on kind of basic, right, about like powertrain and drive, lines and suspension and things like that. And I just think over time you have less issues with that sort of stuff, because it kind of gets fleshed out and more refined and whatnot over time. And those were new at the time. And now the new stuff is, infotainment and connectivity and, all the software driven aspects of the vehicle that you didn't necessarily have before. So, so I think, yeah, just the types of problems I guess people are having over time changes. But also the way, and I think we alluded to it before, but just the way that we have to ask these questions changes. Because the things that people have in their cars are not the same things that they had before. So, if we were to never ask people if they had issues with their infotainment system, it would look like no cars have those issues, right? Because you're not actually reflecting it in your survey. So, yeah, so I guess it's mainly the types of issues. And then certainly with electric vehicles, yeah, it made a huge change, right? Because these were all little tweaks over time, right? But this is the biggest change we've probably had, in a long time. So introducing entirely new types of questions, about batteries and chargers and things like that. So,
Yeah.
But yeah, as far as people's preferences on what reliability is, I think that's a more difficult question, I suppose, and one that I don't have as great of an answer for, I guess. Yeah, but yeah. Go ahead.
So when it makes me think about your methods for adapting these questions and including the different metrics that are okay, actually this represents reliability. How does your team go about that? Is it that you take the cars out and you drive them? Is it, what is your methods behind the scenes to make sure that you are asking the right questions? Is it psychology?
Mm.
What is it?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I think some of it just comes down to our own expertise of having these vehicles, driving them, living with them. Maybe I should have provided a little more background on what we do, but we buy every single car that we test. And we've been doing that for, I guess, our entire existence, long before I've been here. But so we're buying every single car. They're the mainstream trims. We're all driving them, kind of living with them, even just outside of the formalized testing that we do. We're taking these cars home, driving them around, grocery shopping, taking our families places, things like that. And we've been doing that since the days of like the Mitsubishi Miev, or that very first early EV, right? In the very first model, or Nissan Leaf. So, I guess I specifically have my own electric vehicle experience, but collectively at CR, been dealing with electric vehicles for a really long time. So, and by owning them, we service them, right? So we taking them to the dealers anytime things break and things like that. So, I would say, yes, there is a certain amount of just like polling the world in a sense to get a sense of what the problems are that people are experiencing, but we're also seeing it from the inside out by owning all these cars and dealing with it, at the forefront.
Yeah, certainly significant to, of course, get behind the wheel. But yeah, the fact that the long-term ownership, which is, I have a company lease that's a VinFast VF8. And
oh, cool.
There are a lot of, reviews sitting in it for a day or a couple hours. So now we get the chance for a 3-year lease to see how it goes. So yeah, you can follow along with that.
I will definitely be following along. That sounds interesting. Yeah, we keep typically we keep the cars for 1 to 2 years, but a lot of the EVs we've been keeping longer just because first of all, we like to have a representative vehicle on hand from each brand at all times, basically. But just with EVs changing so quickly and doing extra tests on EVs that we're not necessarily doing on gas cars. I think right now our fleet of EVs is like 25 cars or something like that. It's pretty significant. So we have them all, over the air updates coming through all the time, all that stuff. So, so I guess just collectively there's a decent amount of experience in just, living it firsthand.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So looking ahead, as the automotive industry continues to transition towards electrification, although we have seen some news of divestments or delays in divestments or changes in electric plans, it's a little bit of a bummer, but we're keeping an eye on things. It's not the end of electric, that's for sure.
No.
But what do you foresee from your perspective as the most significant challenges and or opportunities in not only assessing the reliability of electric and hybrid vehicles, but electrification in general going forward?
Yeah, I think from the reliability standpoint, I really think it's building up this historical knowledge of, different types of technologies over time, how they hold up. Especially when you start thinking about used cars, right? We've talked a lot about stuff today, and it's really mostly in reference to new cars, right? But with used cars and thinking about battery health and the capacity of these batteries over time, especially as we haven't really even settled on the type of battery chemistry we all like for different things, right? So what does an NMC battery look like today, but an LFP looks like something else 10 years after its life? I think just from reliability and EVs in general, just building up that historic knowledge of how these technologies really withstand over time and hold up to the test of time. I think that's a huge opportunity, and it's going to help both new car shoppers, used car shoppers, right? Especially as more of these kind of used EVs flood the market. But so that's a big one. And I think just zooming even out further from that, it really comes down to the charging. And I know there's a lot of stuff in the news lately, basically as we speak. But the charging networks are just because of what we talked about before. Even if it's the thing that you use 5% of the time, maybe 10% of the time you're using a DC charger, it can just have such a huge impact. And I just think it really, having that network down, reliable, accessible, and widespread enough just makes the whole thing so much more viable. So if you really want these electric vehicles to be a viable option, and maybe doesn't necessarily have to mean that they are the only option, but if they are going to work for more people, that part, practically speaking, yes, but also just for like the psychology part of it, right? Just thinking to myself, yeah, I could get away with doing this. I think it's a big one.
Do you consider that out of your wheelhouse at Consumer Reports to start to really turn to look at the electric vehicle charging infrastructure because of the huge influence that it has on consumer experience? Or are y'all saying that as significant, hey, we need to, of course you're keeping an eye on it, but to what degree are you incorporating this into your work?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. No, it's definitely not out of our wheelhouse. I mean, I think, certainly at the vehicle level, just as we are starting to think about, everybody carrying around an adapter potentially, or just it's like vehicle compatibility with different types of chargers. It's helping people navigate that. Just again at the vehicle level, like, yeah, will my Fisker work with this charger or whatever the combination is, right? There's that. So, and then thinking about reliability, or not, actually reliability and satisfaction from a charging network standpoint, right? Not even necessarily the vehicle standpoint. So not somewhere where we are today as we speak, but something to consider is just the reliability and satisfaction people actually have with these different types of networks, because they can be so different, right? Tesla compared to Electrify America or whatever, that experience is maybe not the same as it is going from one gas station to another. So I think that's just another area that we really have to kind of dig our heels into and try to understand as best as we can.
I also think, right, like from your point of view, it's important not to push any kind of technology or car over another, but just to give the fact. But many folks that I know do want their next car to be electric, or they're considering hybrid. But even if, they've never owned an EV and they don't know about EVs, I've heard that from a lot of people. So from your point of view, are there any maybe not even lingering misconceptions or barriers of most importance that need to be addressed to help folks make the best choice for them in terms of going electric or staying ICE or choosing hybrid? In your opinion, from your research, that we can better be ambassadors of healing that kind of misconception?
I mean, there's a ton. The one that jumps to the top of the list is range anxiety. I think, when somebody's considering, and this is what we see in our own kind of survey data outside of reliability and satisfaction, just like doing nationwide surveys and stuff and polling EV owners, is when they're shopping or at the stage of maybe I want an EV, maybe not. Range anxiety is kind of here at the top of their list of things they're most, the barrier to entry, if you will. And then once somebody does decide to go with an EV, range anxiety goes away. Or I shouldn't say it goes away, but it starts moving down the list. And I think, because they kind of get used to their vehicle, they understand what the range is. It's something you can kind of like plan for, right? But the thing that does not move is charging anxiety, essentially, is what I'm going to call it, is that stays up top, right? Because you don't know, and we're talking DC charging again, but you just don't know what you're going to show up to, right? The charger might be broken, it might have a line, or it might, be functioning at half the rate or whatever. So I think, I would say don't be, try to decide what a reasonable range is for you based on your driving, whether you're doing long trips or if it's just mostly around town and you have that, access to a charger at home. But I think range anxiety tends to be less of an issue once people kind of learn their vehicle and get used to it.
And then it's like, okay, well, charging anxiety is unfortunately out of my hands and your hands.
Yeah, right. It is.
So, and is there any collaboration you see with the most potential to either alleviate that concern or better educate or inform about it?
About charging anxiety?
Yeah, because I feel like, I mean, maybe range anxiety too, but I feel like that's a lived experience when you can
Yeah.
get rid of range anxiety, but the charging anxiety remains because of your experience.
Right. Well, and I think, yeah, some of that is like, for instance, with the testing that we're doing, one thing we started to score in our road tests and whatnot is the route planning capabilities of the car, right? Like, how well can it, if I want to go from Connecticut to Chicago, like the best cars can just tell me where to go and where I'm going to stop and for how long, right? Whereas some cars don't do that at all. So I think just bringing to the top of the conversation some of these tools that are unfamiliar but can be super, super helpful, right? The apps and yeah, the route planning stuff in the car. Letting people know the types of charge speeds they can expect in terms of, I think, a huge one, and one that I implemented on our website and I think is really important, is the miles of range added per some amount of time while charging, right? Because you look at manufacturer information or whatever, and it's like, oh, 10 to 80% in 30 minutes. It's like, that sounds good, but that could be 100 miles, that could be 200 miles. Like, what are we actually talking about? So just using metrics that are consistent and helpful, right? Less MPGE, more miles per kilowatt hour, for example, stuff like that. So yeah, I think it's just being transparent, educating people, and using the right information and terms.
That's true. Yeah, the language around it is definitely a learning curve for everyone, but how to use the terms that make sense to the most people and are accurate.
Yeah, right.
Can be adopted throughout any conversation,
right?
Because there are differences, and a lot of people are like, "What's a kilowatt versus a kilowatt hour?"
I know. Yeah, we have we had to put a. You can go find. We have like a glossary on our website. That's like, if you're before you go read any electric vehicle road tests or reviews or whatever, or watch any videos, like, here are some terms that you should be familiar with, because it's just going to start flying at you, and it's hard to avoid. So you just kind of have to learn it a little bit, right? All these unfamiliar things, yeah.
And route planning, that's a great topic that you do bring up, and it is so great when we are testing EVs and we see this has a great route planner. It's accurate.
Oh, it's awesome.
It has all this information. It'll take me there. It'll plan this out for me so that it can relieve my anxiety about it. It has dynamic data. So maybe that wasn't a surprise, but that's something that came up where you were like, oh yeah, this is an important factor to have in EVs. It made me think, has there been any other surprises that have come across in your testing that have either changed the way that you look at EVs, or you survey about EVs, or just, we're just like, oh, well, that's really important to consider. And now we really see.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think, some of the smartphone app stuff might be another one that I was a little surprised to see and learn. Oh, and I have some more. I gotta not forget. But the smartphone app one, definitely, I was surprised to learn how many people are using them. Even people even with their gas cars use them quite a bit. But
like Apple CarPlay, Android Auto.
No, like the companion app for your phone. That's like my Lexus or my whatever, right? So that
VinFast app.
Yeah, exactly. So you can precondition the car or change the charge scheduling stuff, because you get into the car and you want to set up the whole departure schedules and all this stuff, right? Can kind of be. I mean, some are better than others, but a lot of tapping around on the screens and whatever. If I can just do that from my couch and upload it to the car, cool. That's a lot easier. So I was a little surprised at some of that stuff. Also, surprised at how people are using their vehicles, I guess, to extend range and things like that. So using eco climate modes and eco drive modes when they're on the highway, and really it's shutting climate off in some cases. Like, that's always a thing you see on Reddit. People say like, oh, just shut your climate off so you can save a couple miles. But like, at least from our studies that we've done, people are doing it for real. So I mean, that was kind of surprising. So ultimately, like, those things can influence the way that we do our range testing, for example, right? If I learn that everybody on the highway, or not everybody, but the majority are doing their long highway drives using these eco modes, or only using heated seats instead of climate, whatever, that can influence the way we're testing. That way we're making sure we do it in a way that's representative of consumer behavior and things like that, even if it's not something I might do or whatever. It's not about me, it's about the consumer. So so a lot of behaviors, I guess, with EV drivers that are a little different than gas,
Mm-hmm.
owners.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm in the South, and it's already hot and humid, and I don't really want to turn off my AC, even if
Right.
it'll get me
Well, right. And
a
that's,
few miles longer.
yeah. And that's a balance too, right? From our perspective, it's like, yeah, okay, this thing will save you a couple miles if you do it, but at what cost? Like
Yes.
comfort and potentially safety. If you like are sweating yourself out in your car to get that
Oh my
extra
God,
5 miles, that's not a good idea.
yeah. I mean,
So,
I got my dog in the back seat. He's
yeah,
hot.
yeah,
There's
right.
no way. So very interesting. And then it makes me also think of over-the-air updates.
Mhm.
How do you see the role of over-the-air updates being able to improve reliability? I mean, sometimes they're as quick as that, problem solved. How
Right,
does that
right.
come into your research as well?
Yeah, over the air updates are tricky. I mean, it's less on reliability, I guess, at the moment. I mean, I do think, yeah, there are instances like, if somebody reports that their infotainment system's crashing all the time, for example, like that can come across as a reliability issue, right? And if that's fixed with over the air software updates, then totally that can impact reliability in a sense. I think seeing some of that with Fisker right now, right before our eyes. But um, I think where it really is a challenge is on just the testing side, right? You might, since we buy all these cars, whatever, and we go through this regimented process, we might test a car that has a certain feature, when we first buy it, and then it gets updated as the car is halfway through the testing or later, right? And then we have to go back and make a change. And we can totally do that. Don't get me wrong. It just can become a little bit more cumbersome, I guess, because you're always trying to track these updates, right? A car doesn't just live as it was purchased from the dealership anymore. Those days have sailed. So I never remember when we did I did like this early review, we call them, these videos on YouTube or whatever, and I did it with the Rivian R1T when we first got it. And when we got it, the key fob had a ton of issues with like reception, and like it wouldn't really unlock the doors properly, and the door handles wouldn't come out. And it was before it had the kneel mode and all this stuff. So like just access to the vehicle was kind of a problem, right? Or at least not as easy as it could be. And then, of course, like we publish the video, right? And then, like a couple days later, an update comes through where the key fob reliability is increased now, and whatever. So it can be challenging to stay on top of that stuff. But I think just being aware of it and being transparent that, hey, yeah, like this is what it was when we first tested it, but now we got to make an update because it's changed. So another benefit of keeping the cars and owning them for a while.
That is true.
Yeah.
And evolving your practices with everything that you learn. So I'm
Yeah.
sure, at Consumer Reports, as you've spoken about in this conversation, you've adapted to a lot of the changing world. You're evolving along with electrification and
Totally.
what consumers are actually doing and interested in.
Mhm.
Is there any other, or are there any other future plans or strategies for Consumer Reports coming up in the future or now in terms of electric that you can share with us?
In terms of electric, I mean, I think,
Or anything, I guess.
yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I mean, just expanding our testing. I mean, we just added a bunch of electric vehicle tests, if you will, to kind of our repertoire. Again, the route planning, the apps, the range test, right? But I guess the way I see it is all these things are, they're iterative in the sense of we can build on them, we can get better, right? Like last year was the first time we published our range test data, right? And I know you guys all do a very similar thing, which is awesome. This 70 mile per hour kind of highway range test. And you know what? Like we learned a lot doing it the first time. So now going into, we're about to start, once it warms up just a little bit more, doing our kind of second round with all the EVs we've collected in our garage since then. But we learned a lot the first time, and I know, okay, I can actually set the parameters a little tighter here. I can make some tweaks here just to make the test more robust and the results that much better, right? So I think just continuing to, just because we introduced a test doesn't mean like, okay, it's got to stay this way forever, or put a flag in the sand, so to speak, or whatever. We can just keep growing and making things better. And I guess another example maybe that I can share is just expanding our information on plug-in hybrids, right? And we've kind of already started to do that, but as those become more of a topic these days, right? Just we used to kind of, let's say like the RAV4, for example, buy the hybrid, buy the regular one. Maybe we test drive the Prime and have a couple words to say on it, but maybe we didn't buy it for formal testing. But now really taking plug-in hybrids, I guess, a little bit more seriously, and buying those versions too, and putting them through the testing process. And there's some aspects that are different about those too, right? So yeah, just really doubling down on presenting the facts to people and say, here are all of your powertrain options and all of your different types of options, and giving people the tools to make the best decision for themselves that they can, right? It shouldn't be me telling you what's best for you. It should be me telling you, here's what it all is, and guiding you to make the decision, that you think is right.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, similar to our mission over here is like, we'll tell you what's good and what's not great, and what we live with, but maybe, what you would want to consider. Yeah, it's important. Right. I mean, buying a car is an important decision. EVs seem to be oddly divisive, and so they have the most. It is weird. It's really weird. They're a fun toy. They're your car. I know. They're a tool, if anything. If it's electric.
Pretty great at it for most cases, right? In terms of acceleration and thinking about the Lightning. When you say tool, like that vehicle really comes to mind with all of its power plugs and USB ports and this and that. Some pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, that's true. And I love how quiet they are, and they can zip around, and they do have some more bells and whistles in the pet mode, like just things that have come along with them too. Yeah. And of course, you, Alex, have been speaking from the Consumer Reports point of view, but do you have an EV that you really like?
Oh gosh. I mean, yeah, for sure. The one that keeps having me come back is actually the Ioniq 6, the Hyundai Ioniq 6. I think it looks, I'm not going to say it's like beautiful necessarily, but it looks weird, which I kind of like it. Yeah, I think it looks cool. It drives really nice. It might not be the quietest one on the market or whatever, but yeah, I just think it looks cool and it drives well. Range is not so bad either. Charging is good. So, that one keeps having me, keeps grabbing my attention, I guess, when I go to pick a car to drive.
Oh, fun. Yeah. I do think Hyundai and Kia are doing, they have a good approach so far. So good.
And I do like being able to just have all the regen settings right at my fingertips, because I don't know, my commute home, for instance, and here and back there are some stretches that are just like 50 miles an hour for 10 minutes at a time or whatever. And then I'm in a city right after that where maybe I want the one pedal turned on. So I think it's just kind of nice and kind of fun to just have those settings right there.
Customized.
Yeah, exactly. What about you though? What's your favorite? Is it
that's a VinFast? Oh, it's totally the VinFast VF8. It's not, I mean, y'all can see it. Y'all have heard it if you've been tuning into the podcast. We like this EV. My dad, who's been driving Tesla since 2018, he's like, this isn't, it was touted as one of the worst reviewed EVs.
I know, I saw all that. We haven't got our hands on one, but.
Oh, well, maybe I can come up there and y'all can hang out with.
Oh, we can definitely hang out. Yeah. You're more than welcome anytime.
I really, I've road tripped the Rivian, and that was really fun. I mean, but I do have a dream EV, although I haven't driven it, but it's the VW ID Buzz.
Okay.
I want the Buzz life.
Okay. That's cool. I mean, hopefully it'll eventually show up.
I know, that's what I'm waiting for. 2024.
Yeah.
Here.
All right.
We'll have to see. But yeah, there's a lot of good options. I think the Rivian's really comfortable. I liked being able to zip around in a truck. Typically sometimes it can feel like I'm in a big vehicle, but it's been fun. Luckily, we're in a position where we get to try all these EVs.
I know, it's pretty amazing.
Continue to give great information out there that is clear to the point, pros and cons where there's pros and cons, and help folks make an informed decision. So I really appreciate your time today, Alex,
for
coming onto the podcast. Yeah, sharing all about your approach at Consumer Reports, how it's changed over time, the different trends. Is there anything else that you would want folks to take away from this conversation?
Oh, gosh. I was going to say, check our website for all the latest information on cars and EVs and how we're, kind of evolving over time. And if you're interested in the range, information and stuff like that on EVs, that'll probably be out, towards the end of the summer. So about to get started on, I think we have over almost a dozen EVs to get to this year as far as range and everything goes. So that should be fun. So
yeah, that will be fun. So doing it in the warmer months, and because it's different in the colder months, right? So
it is. Yeah, I mean, and the methodology there is we've done a bunch of cold weather testing, over time. And so we kind of have like, the general trends, right, to apply to a best case scenario. So the summer testing, right, in kind of this 80-degree weather is at least as close as we can get it, best case scenario. And then we can say, okay, here's what you would get maximum in this scenario if it were 32 degrees, apply this correction factor to it, essentially. I would love to actually go out and test every EV in cold and summer, but ultimately we're a pretty small team, and getting to that and managing resources is always tricky, as I'm sure everybody knows. So
Definitely.
Right now that's the methodology.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. And thank you for your time and energy and your insight. I really appreciate it. And
this was great.
Hopefully, we can continue to collaborate.
I would love to.
I think that's really important, and sharing ideas and sharing approaches and learning together as we
I love that idea.
Forward.
Yeah. And anytime if y'all want to come out to the track here in Connecticut, our doors are always open. So we're happy to, show people and share and do exactly that.
Would love that. We got to take the Benfast out ripping on the track.
Yeah. There we go.
Ooh, fun stuff.
Yep.
Yeah. And thank you everyone for tuning into the Out of Spec podcast. I'm sure you'll have some questions, some comments on this discussion. So make sure to put those in the comments. Go to Consumer Reports to check out the work. And thank you for plugging in with us today. I hope you have a great rest of your day. We'll see you next time on the next episode of the Out of Spec podcast. Bye-bye.